Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
So today I'm very, very pleased to have Max Thrax, the author and managing editor at Apocalypse Confidential on the podcast. I contacted you having read your book God is a Killer, the Alpha edition. I'm not sure how much it differs from the previous edition. We can get into that. But it's a super, super fast-paced, I guess you'd call it noir. I'd like to hear how you'd categorise it. But super fast-paced. It feels like boiling a crime novel, evaporating off all its skin, soft tissues, and then reading what's left. I had a blast, so I'm very pleased to be able to chat to you today about it. Is there anything else you're up to other than your writing and your work at Apocalypse Confidential that I've missed?
You mean like in my spare time, or
things that listeners to the podcast might conceivably interact with? I'm not asking about your favorite lunch spots.
Well, I have a bunch of short stories published in various places. I mean, I probably published 15 to 20 in the past few years. I mean, it's kind of difficult to promote those things online because not everyone's interested in reading a story that you wrote 2 years ago, maybe, but maybe they are. Maybe I should do that more often. I don't know. But yeah, they've been published in various places. I published a bunch of poetry, like dozens and dozens of poems. And I mean, I haven't really written any nonfiction or published any. So just, I focus on poetry and fiction. Mm-hmm. And, behind the scenes, I'm always working on some kind of long form narrative, like a novel. And my second novel is going to be like finally done sometime in the next couple months. And hopefully I'd like to get it out before the end of the year. So that's what I'm looking to do right now. And actually yesterday, I just finished writing the first draft of a film script. My friend,
really?
Low Res, do you know the director Low Res Wonderbread?
I'm a complete Philistine when it comes to film.
No, that's fine. He runs this production company called Forgotten Genres. They actually just released the audiobook of God is a Killer. So it's actually
I saw you had an audiobook out of it.
Yeah, I got the audio. Yeah, I read the whole thing. And so he put that out, and we've known each other for a while. And he came to me maybe 6 months ago and said, "Well, do you have any screenplays? I'm looking for stuff that I can film." I said, "No, but I could write you one." So that was, probably, like I said, 6 months ago. And I put it aside for a while to finish what's going to be the next novel. But I got back to it once the new year rolled around. And I finally finished the first draft last night. So I've got that to kind of work with and mess around with for the rest of the month. And then I'll get back to the novel.
That's very cool. So one thing that really stood out to me in God is a Killer is how chatty it is, how dialogue heavy it is. And I suppose that would translate really, really well over into a film script. I mean, God is a Killer is so lean, you probably wouldn't actually need to snip much out of it to just turn it into a script.
Well, thank you. I mean, in my world, that's a huge compliment because, I try to make it as condensed as possible, as boiled down and compressed as I possibly can. And I mean, that can definitely carry over into, film scripts. Like if you look at The Maltese Falcon, the novel is not that much different from the script of the film. But it can really depend because when Raymond Chandler and Billy Wilder were trying to adapt Double Indemnity, which is a James M. Cain novel, and Cain is known as a writer of great dialogue. And I forget who it was. I think Wilder wanted to keep all the original dialogue. And Chandler said, no, that's not going to work. And Chandler won out eventually because sometimes when you're writing a film or a film script, it's less like writing a novel, more like kind of like making a comic book with real people. Because a lot of times as the script writer, you're just providing captions to the visual that's on screen. Because I would say the film is primarily a visual medium. Mm-hmm. You don't necessarily need dialogue, but it can help. It can be a little bit different. It can be tricky, and once you're actually kind of getting your hands dirty, working in these different mediums, you see what the differences are, and how difficult it can be to bridge some of these gaps. But I'm pretty happy with the draft of the film script, and I'm pretty happy with, what's getting close to be the completion of this novel. So I'm in a pretty good place right now.
That's really, really exciting. I look forward to both of those things. I was going to ask if you were writing another novel because I really enjoyed this one. The sense of speed is the defining feature of it for me. It targets almost my personal weakness. I'm just terrible with names, and you're blasted with about 5 new characters in a few pages because the thing just absolutely hauls ass. So I'd like to ask how you would describe God as a Killer, because I'm often quite interested to see how much daylight there is between how I describe a particular novel and how the author themselves describes it. So how would you intro God as a Killer to someone?
As a general description, I'd say that it's a rural noir thriller because it has all that ingredients. I mean, obviously it takes place in the woods in New Hampshire, which is a very rural area of the United States. It's in my region, which is New England. I'm in the Boston area. So I live about a couple hours away from where the book actually takes place. And just in general, I mean, it is noir, and I'm not really a stickler about noir. It can depend on who you're talking to. If you're just talking to the general reader, you can call lots of different things noir. But if you're talking to a noir buff, like some of my friends online, you need to be a little more specific, because noir can get very specific in what it means. You know, if you've read about it, or if it's something that you follow, or you're a serious fan of, or you're a noir scholar. And then the book it's written more like a thriller. It's not a PI novel. I mean, there are aspects of detection. There's different aspects, but when I was writing it and looking at, how I should structure it, or just how I should structure a novel in general, the one book that I really took to the woodshed and just kind of worked it with and tried to take apart was Silence of the Lambs.
Really?
Yeah. Because I thought, well, if I'm gonna try to write a thriller, and hopefully write a good one, let's try to learn from the best. And for a contemporary thriller, I can't think of too many novels that are probably better than that one. I mean, maybe Red Dragon, another Thomas Harris novel, but for my purposes, I just picked that one. And I learned a lot about pacing and what should happen in a scene, how the characters should interact. It was a textbook for me leading up to the writing of this book. So rural noir thriller. I mean, I think that pretty much covers it.
Okay, yeah. So I was slightly hesitant to use the term noir because I am aware that some people take it very seriously. It's sort of like talking about music subgenres with certain people. They get very exercised about very minute differences that might escape me. So it's good to hear that you also consider it to at least some extent to be noir. What are the features of noir that sticklers are going to latch onto and say, okay, this categorically disqualifies something from being noir, or conversely, this is absolutely characteristic of noir?
Well, that's a really good question, because I mean, noir, especially, I mean, we're almost 80 years on from when the first noir films, the post-war era, when noir was big. And it's not an English word either, so you have that to deal with as well. And I mean, it was the French who kind of latched onto the stuff, and it was French critics who named it and kind of enumerated its different characteristics. And I think if you're talking about the difference between noir and your general crime story, first of all, it's got a dreamlike quality to it that kind of like a police procedural is probably not going to have. That's going to be very much kind of quotidian, the day-to-day details and of what being a law enforcement or police officer is. It should be erotic. There's usually some kind of femme fatale or some kind of, because in these worlds, the noir world is very ruthless, and the men will use violence and women will use sex because it's a way to get things that they want. And of course, everyone's trying to manipulate each other into getting what they want in the end. I would say that it's cruel. And again, getting back to the dreamlike aspect, noir it's almost like having a bad dream or a nightmare that you don't quite know is a nightmare until the end happens. So again, I think just all these things, it's just taking you to a different space. You're not really in the world. You're going into the noir world, where there's kind of this dreamlike logic that's happening to events. And sometimes plot isn't really even that important. It's really about the atmosphere and what's going on inside of the characters. So my novel, it's not really pure noir in that sense, because it's written in a very clipped, telegraphic, hard-boiled style, where I'm not going too much inside the thoughts or the feelings of the characters. I'm not using too much description or exposition either. A lot of what you're learning comes from the characters talking to each other through dialogue. So if you pick it up, it's almost like you're reading, a wiretap or some kind of transcript of, these people talking to each other, and they don't know that you're listening to them. So it is a bit kind of like being a voyeur or being an eavesdropper. You're just or being invisible in the room.
Mm.
and, you know, kind of watching these events unfold. And that's kind of what I try to create as a writer.
That's a really nice way to describe it. So I think I wouldn't sell yourself short with the dreamlike quality, because yes, you do write in a very straight way, but I think the combination of the speed and the parsimony does create its own somewhat dreamlike ambience, because things are just moving so quickly. It's like having one of those no, like flick books flicked in front of your eyes. It can be disorienting in a yeah, it can get you off balance as well. Just the sheer pace of the book.
Well, the pace really comes from, well, the first writer that really got me interested into hard-boiled fiction. I mean, this is as opposed to noir. I mean, there's some overlap between them. But hard-boiled fiction came first, and it was an influence on noir. And the guy who really got me into hard-boiled fiction was Dashiell Hammett, who wrote Red Harvest, Maltese Falcon, Glass Key, because I remember reading, it's a moment I remember very clearly. I was sitting on the bus, and I picked up, my copy of Maltese Falcon and started reading it, and I couldn't believe how much action Hammett could compress into just 15 or 20 pages. I'd never read anything like it, and I thought, this guy's some kind of wizard. How did he do this? Because at the time I was writing at the time, but I was writing more kind of experimental fiction, kind of more like avant-garde stuff. It was influenced by William Burroughs and J.G. Ballard circa Atrocity Exhibition. So it was
I was
much
going
more
to mention the Atrocity Exhibition. Sorry,
yeah,
go on.
But he got me more interested in kind of straightforward narrative and kind of doing it my way. But he's kind of the alpha of hard-boiled fiction and writing dialogue to me. And then the omega is George V. Higgins, who is also a Boston author, and he was born the next town over from where I live, and lived in this area, pretty much his whole life. He wrote a lot about the Boston underworld, and he was one of the foremost practitioners of dialogue, I think, in pretty much any genre in the 20th century. And he ended up being a big influence on both Elmore Leonard and David Mamet, who I was already fans of before I picked up Higgins. So when I finally got to him and his first novel, The Friends of Eddie Coyle, I just couldn't. It was almost too good to be true, because it completely validated my decision to start writing crime fiction instead of doing this experimental stuff.
I didn't realize that The Friends of Eddie Coyle was Higgins' first novel. So I read it on your recommendation, and yeah, man, his first novel, that's remarkably confident.
Well, he'd been writing for a long time, and he knew a lot about these kinds of characters because he worked as a U.S. attorney. The other thing about Hammett and George V. Higgins is that they wrote about criminals expertly, because they were coming from the side of the man, I guess, in the sense that, Hammett was a Pinkerton detective. So in the United States, they would, they were responsible for, breaking up, worker strikes and stuff like that. And, once Hammett always felt kind of ambivalent about it. And after he quit doing it, he felt kind of guilty. I think that guilt kind of chased him for the rest of his life. And then, Higgins was a U.S. attorney focusing on organized crime, especially bank robberies and bank fraud. So he'd seen these guys that are in the book, guys like, Jimmy Scalise or Artie Van. He knew plenty of those guys. He'd seen them up close. He knew exactly how they talked, how they walked, everything. So I think there was a lot of work and a lot of time that went into that first novel. And of course, unfortunately for him, that was his best book and kind of the most high profile he ever was, because the movie came out a few years after that, which is also a great movie with Robert Mitchum. That movie flopped, and Hollywood was never interested in him again. And the publishing industry, he never stopped writing his entire life or publishing books, and he was always kind of a name, but the publishing industry kind of passed him by, because Eddie Coyle came out in the early 70s. And at the time, it was a bestseller. I think it probably sold like 50,000 copies or something like that. But by the end of the decade, when you're getting into, going into the 80s, and it's, Stephen King, Danielle Steele zone, these bestsellers were selling 5 million copies. So he wasn't, this type of fiction, the kind of writer he was not the same priority to publishing houses that he had been at the beginning of the 70s. But, at the end of the day, he wrote The Friends of Eddie Coyle. He wrote a bunch of other good books. And he made a huge mark on crime fiction and on me as a reader and as a writer. So I have the utmost respect for him.
Yeah, I can see some similarities between God is a Killer and The Friends of Eddie Coyle. I mean, there are aesthetic ones like the pace, the spareness, the fact that McDougal got done for selling AR-15s, and Eddie Coyle was a small times weapon dealer.
That's right.
I'm
Well,
not.
yeah, I'm glad.
I'm not sure if that was intentional, but
You know, it wasn't intentional, but I'm glad that you noticed that because it does make sense. That part was the character of McDougal he was inspired by David Koresh and the Branch Davidians and all that went on in the the early to mid 90s. And I read this book called How the Millennium Comes Violently, which is an academic book about doomsday cults. Or being an academic book, they don't call them that. They call them new religious movements. But it went into all all the greats, Heaven's Gate, the Branch Davidians, Aum Shinrikyo in Japan. So I drew upon some of that lore because when I was reading about the Branch Davidians, I mean, I knew who David Koresh was, and I kind of knew what was going on there. But he was not the clear-cut successor to be the leader of that group. There was a lot of intergroup rivalry, and a lot of people who wanted to be the leader after the old one had died. So I put some of that lore into the novel because there are some flashbacks where it goes back to his days, in the group, before he got thrown into prison and, kind of the power struggles that went on and that are still kind of in the back of his mind, kind of haunting him in some ways.
One thing I was interested in is at the author's, just the forward of the Alpha edition, you note that God is a Killer was fairly different in a previous iteration of it, where McDougal, instead of being this David Koresh inspired zealot gun runner, coming back to reclaim a house and a body that are meaningful to him, he was an alien hunter, or he was looking for alien skeletons.
Yeah, I don't know. It was pretty wild, and I'm not even a science fiction writer, but that was the idea that came to me at first. I think I just went to my writing desk one morning, and I just had this image of a guy in a parka sitting on a porch in the middle of the woods, and it was raining, and he's waiting for one of his minions to kind of come back and tell him about these alien bones that they thought were buried somewhere. And I don't know why it came to me, but it just did. So I just started with that. And I knew his name was McDougal and that he was he was the leader of some kind of fringe group, whether it was, religious or not. So this novel, the initial kind of version of what became God as a Killer, I probably wrote about 50 pages of it. There were two narratives going on. One was McDougal and his merry band of, alien hunters who were going around to these different sites with their archaeological tools and kind of digging up, trying to find these alien bones that they were utterly convinced were there, but, probably were not. And then the other story was this woman getting impregnated by an alien, and, her husband notices something weird going on, but doesn't quite know what it is. And somehow McDougal figures out that she's carrying this alien baby and he kidnaps her. And that was the idea for the book. And I think after about 50 pages, I just thought, I don't really know where this is going. I didn't plan it out or anything. I was just writing off the seat of my pants. And so I put that away and I thought, okay, well, I like this McDougal guy. He seems like he can kind of make things happen because he's totally ruthless. So what else can I do? How can I create a conflict that will just drive this novel all the way through? And I decided, well, if there's going to be a conflict between two different ideas or two different concepts or whatever, it's going to be commerce versus religion. So McDougal represents his version of religion. And then Sarah, who is a former member of the cult, now owns the house that was the old compound, is a businesswoman. And of course, McDougal is always accusing her of selling out and going over to Satan and, turning the house into a brothel and, all this stuff. So coming up with that conflict, I mean, the conflict itself doesn't really matter. It could be almost anything, but I thought there should be some kind of opposition that drives us through. Even if when you read the book, you're not thinking, oh, this is obviously about religion versus commerce. I think in a sense, it's probably more important to the writer than the reader sometimes to have these things in mind because they don't necessarily need to see the work that went into it. In my writing in general, I mean, as you've said, it's pretty clipped, it's pretty fast paced. So subtext is very important for me. And even though these books and stories that I write are very short, they can take a long time because everything needs to be in the right place in order to get the effect that I want on the reader. So I'm always looking at the subtext and kind of what's going on between the words and the sentences and the paragraphs and chapters. That's what really concerns me. It's not necessarily writing a perfect sentence, because given the book, I mean, the perfect sentence could be he closed the door, or he called her on his phone. That could be the perfect sentence for that part of the book. So that kind of stuff doesn't really interest me. What I'm focused most on is the overall reading experience and kind of what you feel while you're reading it and what you take away once you're done. I'm not trying to wow anybody with like elaborate or Latinate sentences. I mean, that would be inappropriate for my genre anyway. So I just don't even bother.
It's interesting what you're saying about McDougall's, about the specifics of McDougall's motivations being less important, or at least it may be less important for the reader. Because I did feel that way, that it felt that McDougall is so monomaniacal, so driven, that if he weren't motivated by, interestingly, chasing bones as well, not alien bones, but a different set of bones, then it'd just be something else. It's more the force of his character rather than any particular application of that force that made him so interesting to me.
Well, I think that you're right. I mean, it doesn't really matter what his motivation is, as long as it's important to him. It doesn't necessarily need to be important to you. But what's important is that he is motivated by something, and that there's a conflict in him trying to get what he wants. What's important is that McDougall is. I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Oh, what's important is that McDougall is.
Right.
Like he's there and he's coming, and the interesting part is characters reconciling themselves to that fact. Yeah,
well, as far as he's concerned, Daddy's coming home, and that's exactly what Timmy wants, and that's exactly what Sarah does not want. That's the last thing in the world that she wants. That's the worst news that you could possibly give her, which is that McDougall is back, because that's a part of her life that she would much rather forget about.
You also mentioned that this earlier instantiation of God as a killer, I think it was called Bury the Dead.
Yeah, it was called Bury the Dead.
Yeah, had a lot of, you called it contrived symbolism. your words, not mine. But were you running into problems by trying to start a novel, basically just trying to build the form of these symbolic ideas as the motivating principle behind it, and ran out of steam? Or
no, it wasn't that at all.
Deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, those were things that I just kind of gradually included in the novel, just to kind of get the theme across. But I mean, I didn't change the name of the book or taking that stuff out because I thought it was bad. I took it out because I felt that I had to, because I wrote this book, it was called Bury the Dead. And I knew that I wanted it to be published by Close to the Bone, which is a British publisher, a British crime kind of pulp transgressive publisher. And I absolutely knew that I wanted to send it to them. They were the perfect choice for me. And my friend Stephen Golds, who I mentioned in the foreword, he runs the website Punk Noir now. He's been running it for a few years. So they publish, noir fiction, noir poetry. And at the time, he was the poetry editor Close to the Bone. He was running their Twitter page. And he had already signed a deal with them to release a book called Always the Dead, which was coming out, in a few months after I was going to send it to them. So I thought, I can't possibly send them this book called Bury the Dead and have them publish it after they've already published this book called Always the Dead. I mean, maybe they would have, but I wasn't going to take that risk. And I didn't want to, he's a friend of mine. So I didn't want to seem like I was trying to copy or, take anything away from the title of his book. So that was really a last minute decision. And I just thought, well, I came up with a list of titles. God is a Killer. It seemed like it was the best one. And I took out some of I don't even know why I did. I probably could have left them in, but I took some of these, kind of references to burials and stuff out. And I thought, well, if they can't read this as a thriller, then they can't read it at all. So if I took out some of the symbolism, it's probably not going to suffer too much. So I did that, and it seemed to work fine. And I mean, I'm glad all that did happen, because I think that God is a Killer is a better title than Bury the Dead, honestly. So maybe I'll use Bury the Dead later on. Who knows? It might live again.
God is a Killer, it's very memorable as a title. One thing in the book that I was wanting more of, but I don't know how you'd fit it in, was the orgone stuff. Timmy Timmy seems to be a big fan of the orgone accumulator. He's got one. Is this an interest of yours? You have an orgone accumulator in your basement, or are you writing in one of them?
I've had to clarify this before too. I've never actually used an orgone accumulator. I did some research on them to figure out how they were built so I could write about it in the novel. I was familiar with them from being a big Burroughs fan. He was quite fond of orgone accumulators. I think he always had one, somewhere. He was using it, and I was familiar with them
Doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, I was familiar with them through Wilhelm Reich, who created them in the first place, and was fixated on this idea of orgone as being the universal life force. Because I'd read a few of his books, as a teenager, probably when I was just starting to get into more serious literature and reading authors like Burroughs and Kafka and Borges, and I thought, well, Timmy, he was a big fan of being in this cult, the Eternal Nations. He kind of wishes that was still around. But unfortunately for him, it's not. And but if he can't do that, he's going to do something weird. So it's the orgone accumulator. That was just the first thing that came to mind. And I also thought, well, I know some people know what this is, but I don't know if I've read a book that used it as a plot device. So why not include one?
Yeah, well, I not only appreciate it. So I mean, I'm far from a Reich scholar, but I've some passing familiarity with his work. I was pleased that McDougall, in interacting with the satanic orgone accumulator, seemed to feel something when he put his hands in it. I'm not sure if that was intentional or not, but that's how it came across to me. I was very, very pleased by the acknowledgement of the power of orgone.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, yeah, I mean, he does feel. I mean, he's always feeling energies and kind of hearing voices, and that's how he makes sense of his surroundings. He's not clairvoyant or anything, but he has this kind of like mystical approach to the outside world. And he as far as he's concerned, is just pure evil. Like, he can't believe Timmy has bought this and is using it. And he's the dad of the family, and he's going to show him what they do to orgone accumulator if it shows up at the Eternal Mansion. That this, as far as he's concerned, this like sacred site, that's in this orgone accumulator is profaning it. So it's got to go.
As a young appreciator of Burroughs, how did you find Reich's writings? Like, did you get much out of them? Were you perplexed? Because the interactions I've had with them are pretty bizarre. It's
well, that's another
massaging naked patients to dissolve their character armor, and so on.
Well, I think that before I started writing fiction, I was a musician and a songwriter, and I spent I'm not the youngest dude. I'm kind of old, and when I was a kid, probably 12 or whatever, in the mid to late 90s, I read lots of British music magazines. I read like The Enemy every week and stuff like that. And, bands would talk about their favorite books quite often. And it always seemed like the same names would come up. So it was, Burroughs, Ballard, Kafka, stuff like that. So I got into them but also my dad was actually a big Burroughs fan. And when he was younger, he wanted to be a writer. And he was going to get a degree in creative writing. And he wrote an essay on T.S. Eliot and William Burroughs. On Naked Lunch in the Wasteland, like for one of his courses. And, I read the essay, and, so it all just seems like, well, this guy Burroughs, I need to, kind of check him out. So it was actually, I took Naked Lunch off my dad's bookshelf and started reading it. And I think the first scene was probably like the giant dildo, like squirt, like Steely Dan or whatever. So, okay, well, like, what is this? This was very different from any book I'd read before. So I just kind of got into it through that way. And to me, he was just a normal author, more or less, because, my dad liked him. He could talk to me about them. And, all these bands that I like so much were, big Burroughs heads. So it seemed like almost normal to me. Obviously his stuff's pretty weird, or not the easiest books to read for, probably the general reader for a number of reasons. But, I've always been a big fan of his. And, before I started writing crime fiction, he was a big influence on the literary fiction that I was writing. And I think that some of the spirit and, some of the aura maybe hopefully comes through even in some of the crime fiction that I write. Because he is a primary influence for me. He's a guy who got me interested in literature in the first place at a younger age.
Yeah, I had a big Burroughs phase a few years ago. I'm trying to remember the name of the trilogy. He had this fantastic trilogy of books that was kind of like a strange Western with continuous gay sex, the smell of ozone, morphine, and pornographic descriptions of various pistols.
Oh, Cities of the Red Night. That trilogy?
That's it. That's it.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, that's, if you look at it in terms of his career, I mean, that's kind of towards, it's not towards the end, but it's certainly later than Naked Lunch and the Cut Up trilogy and some of his more famous stuff. But I mean, I think Burroughs fans know how good some of those books are. I mean, they're written in a completely different style from something like Naked Lunch. And I mean, his tastes were probably more conventional than most people realize. I mean, not that Graham Greene is conventional per se, but, he's a big Graham Greene fan. He likes traditional narrative. He likes thrillers. He likes, all kinds of stuff. So the stuff that he writes isn't necessarily, the stuff that he wrote wasn't necessarily the stuff that he read every day. That was just what he had to contribute as a writer.
You can see some of that DNA in his writing, the sense of adventure in some of his later books. It's just, it's chopped up and rearranged. It's not immediately apparent, but I think you can see it in there in digested form. Maybe if you squint a bit. Yeah,
well, I think that those books are all well worth reading. Even if you're not a super Burroughs fan, just because, he's kind of similar to George V. Higgins in a way in that, when people talk about him, they're always talking about his first book. Or, I mean, Naked Lunch isn't really his first book, but that's kind of like the first book that kind of established him as a writer, because he'd published Junkie before, which, when it came out, was just published as a dime store crime novel, or like this dime store social problem drug addict novel. It was a pulp novel. That's how it was sold. And then there was Queer, which I don't think was published for a while. I mean, I think the movie just came out, which I haven't seen. And then Naked Lunch was the book that really established him as this, kind of genius, towering figure of, experimental fiction in the second half of the 20th century. And with George V. Higgins, if they're talking about him, they're probably talking about Friends of Eddie Coyle. That book overshadows, the rest of his entire bibliography. So, I mean, they are similar in that sense. And, they've both been, really big influences on me. I think you can probably see both of them a bit in God is a Killer.
Yeah, I was pleased that you mentioned the Atrocity Exhibition by Ballard earlier, because I felt that while God is a Killer is more conventional and a lot easier to follow than Ballard's condensed novels, but you get some of the sense of his condensed novels in God is a Killer, just the parsimony of movement, how you really don't waste much time describing a particular movement or some sort of action in much detail. You'll tend to note it beginning and then its consequences. Everything else has been boiled off, which was a feature of the Atrocity Exhibition that was pretty mesmerizing. Have you been reading much Ballard?
I mean, not recently, actually, but I mean, I read him so much, at a young age, and then, into my adulthood, that I probably would never need to read him again. In a sense. I mean, obviously I will, but I mean, I've read some of those books so many times. They're buried deep in my subconscious, and they probably influence everything I write in some kind of way. So you've got the Atrocity Exhibition, and you've got that trilogy of Crash, High Rise, and then Concrete Island. So yeah, I love that. And that was a big influence on me too. And those were some of the, again, some of the first books that I read when I was starting to get into, serious literature. So, they've made a big impact on me.
The thing with Ballard is, because all of his novels, there is variation. There are various eras of Ballard, but all of them do seem to be at their core a strangely aimless protagonist, or a strangely blank protagonist coming into contact with some alien logic and becoming enfolded in it, and by the end of the novel fully accepting their place within that strange logic. And so he's the sort of author where you can read a lot of his books in quick succession, read him very intensely, and then leave him behind, but that sense of alien logic always stays with you. He was an interesting author in that he really seemed to have one focus and was just hammering that, I guess, apart from maybe his autobiographical works.
Well, I think that you're right about that. And I think that it's very interesting to look at, I keep forgetting, I'm on an Australian podcast, so I can't say Ballard. I don't have to say Ballard. But yeah, it's interesting to look at him. And, he wasn't really a sci-fi author like Isaac Asimov or Robert Heinlein. I mean, they were kind of the old guard when he was coming up, being part of the new wave of science fiction. And in there you do encounter the alien logic, the strange logic, and those kind of, more genre science fiction stories and novels. But he carries over that alien logic to, novels like Crash or High Rise or Concrete Island. And it's the alien logic of the everyday world of the post-war world. So these protagonists are getting this alien logic from, a car park or, an abandoned, construction site or something, or just something that's completely quotidian to us. And that we would probably not even notice. But Ballard, he notices how strange it is. And, kind of that we are, kind of living in this alien environment that's inhuman in many ways. And, the effect that has on the human psyche, and kind of demonstrating that over the course of a novel.
It's fascinating seeing his evolution of beginning with his more overtly science fiction works. I guess you'd call some of the Crystal World or the Drowned World science fiction, maybe more than anything else. But yeah, it's an alien logic, but something manifesting itself in a fantastical way, like time crystals growing on everything.
Well, the Crystal World, that was the first of his novels that I read, because it just happened to be my local library. Unfortunately, they didn't have the Atrocity exhibition there. But yeah, that was the first one that I read, and I just thought it was so beautiful. I mean, nothing really happens in the book other than, the world kind of getting taken over by, these crystals. And that was similar to a couple of other, these kind of apocalyptic novels that he'd written around that time. His stories are a little more sci-fi than some of the novels. His novels are, they're kind of like they're sci-fi or they're transgressive, or they can be almost like novels of ideas. But yeah, he did carry over a lot of the same themes and obsessions, from his, kind of more openly sci-fi stuff to stuff that just takes place in the everyday world and shows what effects, the strange logic of, modernity have on the average person.
It's, you brought up Kafka as well, who's another novelist who, I guess you call him a novelist, but I don't think he ever actually finished his novels, any of them. But he too seemed to be obsessed with, ultimately, it's sort of the logic of bureaucracy, and just wrote novels over and over again about that. It's, he was a similarly obsessive writer in that way as Ballard.
I think I agree. And I think that's in a way, that's a big theme of, life and modernity in the 20th century, the kind of mass age that people got thrown into, mass population, mass war, the mass man, all that kind of stuff. And I'm going to be doing a couple of podcasts with Rare Candy in the next week on Celine.
Oh, nice.
And he deals with he's dealing with a lot of the same themes. And that's where, the black comedy of Celine comes from, because it's the human individual who's caught in this huge inhuman system and is being crushed and can't do anything about it. So there's a fatalism in, Kafka and Celine. It's maybe Ballard doesn't deal with it quite as much, but in Celine, obviously that's a big, heavy theme about what is the individual in this huge kind of like bloodthirsty, inhuman system? What happens to them? So, that's a question that's always interested me, because, these themes are still relevant well into the 21st century.
Yeah, absolutely. So an interesting thing is looking at how these various authors resolve these tensions. Because in Ballard's case, the resolution almost always seems to be surrender to that alien logic and dissolution in it. In Kafka, there also seems to be a notion of surrender, but it's less transformative and less liberating than Ballard's, the dissolving in the logic of a car accident. Instead, I think the castle ends with Kay becoming a cleaner at the local school, and that's just kind of it.
Yeah, he just becomes a cleaner, and then the snow's falling outside, and then the book ends.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. He never finished that. And of course, he didn't want to publish any of this stuff either, or at least not while he was alive. I think he did want it published eventually, even though he told his best friend, Max Brod, not to publish it. And I think that with Ballard, I mean, this is conjecture, but I mean, I think that he was kind of horrified by some of these things that, he saw happening around him, but he was also just fascinated by them and, genuinely interested and also kind of wanted to be a part of them. But, and if you look at his personal life, I mean, he was responsible for raising 3 kids all by himself after his wife died. And in a lot of ways, he was just a bourgeois family man living in the suburbs, fairly buttoned down, personally conservative, not really a political person, but just in his general demeanor, like pretty conservative. And I think that he, if you look at, Crash, I mean, he's got the same name as the protagonist. And I think he probably would want to, maybe do some of these things in real life and see what they're like, but he can't, or he's not going to. So fiction is a way for him to, take his mind into these different places. At least that's kind of what I think, because, he was drawn to these things and also horrified by them. And that's a great combination for a writer.
Yeah. A combination present in all his books of terror and erotic excitation. It's ever present in Ballard's novels. I guess too, when you're a widower raising 3 kids, you can't really afford to be too out there in your personal life. Just the weight of that responsibility maybe demanded that he explore this zaniness in fiction rather than in the real world.
I definitely think so, and I think he was under a lot of pressure, every day to take care of these kids all by himself, and he was the editor for a poetry magazine for whatever reason. I mean, I guess they hired him to do it, and I'm sure he made some money off these novels, but I mean, yeah, he was constantly working, kind of hustling to get this stuff out there, extremely productive. So yeah, I mean, his life was tightly controlled. His life was not wild at all. So he took that wildness and he put it in his books.
I mean, this is wandering into more psychoanalysis land, but I wonder if he were actually able to indulge these fantasies in real life, if he would end up writing anything, if you do need that sort of tension, that psychic tension in order to produce these sorts of things. Similarly, someone like Bataille, I wonder if you do need to be a librarian who, granted in his spare time, can make human sacrifice secret societies, but in his day-to-day life is quite conventional. And if that's needed to write or to produce something this orgiastically strange.
Well, that's a famous quote from Flaubert, that you need to be, orderly and bourgeois in your daily life, and then, kind of savage in your art or your fiction or whatever.
Bottle it up.
Yeah. And, yeah, I mean, it seemed to work for him. He had a very long, prolific career. So, good for him.
One thing you were saying earlier about how you move from writing more experimental fiction to God as a Killer, which, like, would you classify it as genre? I guess if it's noir, it's in some sense genre. But what to your mind defines genre fiction as opposed to literary fiction or experimental fiction? Because both of those, literary and experimental fiction themselves do seem to have their own genre tropes, perhaps ironically given their names, but both of those are identifiably themselves genres. So do you think there is actually a firm separation between those and genre fiction, so-called?
I think it can be fluid. I think that there is a separation because I think that genres differ simply because they have different conventions, and if you're working in a genre, and as I found out trying to write a crime novel, is that if you want to write a crime novel, you have to employ at least some of these conventions because that's what your readers are expecting. They know this genre even better than you do collectively. You're not going to be able to fool them into thinking that you know anything about crime fiction when you really don't. But that can be liberating. Limitations for a writer can also be very liberating because you can put your own spin on things, or you can subvert expectations, in some kind of way, not in some kind of cheap, cynical way, but you can play with the reader a bit, and you can have fun yourself. So that was also a big part of the appeal. And also just the fact that I didn't need to be totally original. I didn't need to focus on that. In a sense, the story was going to write itself. It's kind of like filling out a crossword. So, if I know this goes here, then this has to go here. But to figure that out, you got to know the genre in the first place, and you also need to know how to write that and have it all make sense in a novel. So I would certainly classify it as genre fiction. I mean, it's not your average crime novel, but I didn't want it to be. It's my take on a rural noir novel. And the one thing about my writing is that if you read, some of my other stories or this novel that I'm trying to get published, sometime in the next year, is that, most of my stuff takes place in urban areas, like in and around Boston. It's like street crime or, drug dealing, that kind of thing. And, there's drug dealing in this book too, but it's all in the woods. It's like a bunch of guys like, cooking meth and, what's basically like an underground bunker in the middle of nowhere. So it's different in that sense. But yeah, I don't have any issue with being a genre writer. I mean, I'm not proud of it. I'm not unproud of it. That just happens to be, what I write. I'm happy to be a writer of noir. I mean, I don't see myself changing that anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I was somewhat cautious about it because some people seem to respond allergically to any hint that they're writing, like crime novels or science fiction and so on.
Yeah, well, writers, we have big egos and we all like to think we're special. But the one thing that I've tried to kind of put across to some people who've asked me for advice about writing novels or whatever, is that, you don't need to write Ulysses. You don't need to write Gravity's Rainbow. You don't need to write any of that stuff. You can just write what comes naturally to you. That's always the best place to start. And if you're working in genre, then part of the work is already done for you. You don't need to be super original. But what that means is that you can put all of your energy and focus into the things that actually interest you about your chosen form or your chosen genre. So you can make it individual and do it your way. And people will see that because they'll already be familiar with the conventions that you're using, and they will see how you're using them differently. So in a sense, it's kind of like, going on American Idol and singing a cover song or, whatever, because you're not going to go on a show like that and sing an original song. No one's going to know how to judge you. But if you're singing, Summertime or, whatever, then people have heard that before. They know, they've heard, Nina Simone or whatever. So they know how to judge your voice that way. And it's, I'm not covering somebody else's book or trying to rewrite somebody else's book, but I am working within a genre that has well-defined conventions and I use them. And reading this book, you will see how different I am as a writer by the way that I use these conventions.
Yeah, I like what you said earlier about the conventions in some way being liberating, because it also provides you with a lot of artistic latitude, because you know that there are certain expectations on behalf of a reader. And so you also have the discretion to conform to those expectations or diverge in parts where you think it'll be impactful. So granted, I'm not the world's foremost expert on crime fiction or noir thrillers, but the sort of that force of nature aspect of McDougal seems like something of a departure to me, because say in Fitzroy you've got your crooked sheriff who's a mainstay of noir, your crooked police officer.
Right, he's very Jim Thompson. Have you read any of his stuff? You read any Jim Thompson?
Sorry, go on. No, I don't know Jim Thompson.
Oh yeah, he was the guy who convinced me to write noir. A few of his books have been, adapted into film, and there was a big kind of Jim Thompson. He wrote back in the 50s and 60s. He's like a post-war noir writer. And by the time he died, like a lot of noir writers, all of his books were out of print, but there was a big Jim Thompson revival in the 80s and 90s. And there's a book that features a crooked sheriff called Pop 1280 that I read. And that was the book that kind of got me out of experimental fiction because I read that and I thought, I can see myself doing this as a novel. Like, this is perfect for me. So that was really what got me into crime fiction, I think, just in general. Because I'd read a few crime fiction books before. And, crime in general as a subject interested me a lot. And, reading about organized crime in the real world or, watching crime movies. But every time I'd go to the crime section in a bookstore, it was just like a bunch of detective novels that didn't interest me. And quite frankly, most of them are written for, like middle-aged women. So that's not, as a young guy coming there wanting to read something like Pop 1280 or Friends of Eddie Coyle or Get Carter. These are not the most heavily promoted books, in the crime genre. I didn't even know some of them existed. So, I kind of got into it that way. But I think that, crime, there's a lot you can do with that genre. For whatever reason, people are not doing it. I think just because they associate crime fiction with certain things, like, they think it's, Agatha Christie's great, but you don't have to write a novel like her. You don't have to write a novel like Dennis Lehane. You don't have to write a crime novel like any of these people. You can just find your own voice, your own influences, and you can do your own thing, and that's kind of what guides me as a writer.
Yeah, if you're looking for something meaner, because God is a Killer is a pretty mean book. It's pretty nasty in places. There aren't very many particularly sympathetic people in it.
Yeah, well, Jim Thompson's books are pretty nasty, and Friends of Eddie Coyle, George V. Higgins, there's some nastiness in that book too, and part of that is also just the Boston setting, because people around here, they like their verbals. They're pretty good at insulting each other. They take great pride in that. So that all kind of goes into the book too. It's also a New England thing, and there's probably even more of that in the book that's I'm writing now, because it's or the one that I'm finishing up. It's because it's going to be the first part of a trilogy about a second generation Irish gangster in Boston. So the first book is kind of like his rise to power. And there's a lot of personal abuse in there, because that's first of all, that's the culture that these guys come from, and that's that's how those guys talk in real life, and that's the sort of thing that I like reading, because you don't want to read a book where everyone gets along with each other. Like, what would be the point? So the more conflict there is, the more it's going to be engaging for the reader, even if these people are just straight up criminals that you would not want to meet in everyday life, that you would probably want to run across the street to get away from. But you're more than willing to read about them in a book because they're interesting. I don't have any issue reading real life books about criminals. It's not because I want to be a criminal, but because I think, well, how can somebody actually do this? This lifestyle that, this person's living just seems outrageous to me. So some of that, I think, also gets worked into these novels as well, because I don't think you need to like a character to find them interesting. What's interesting is that these situations they find them in, and the conflict that they have to deal with, because that's what's compelling. It's not because he's a nice guy, or that you want to be friends with him in real life. That has nothing to do with it.
Yeah, and I guess genre fiction is quite good for that, because it provides an examination of perhaps people that you would never want to be associated with, and so on, within a familiar structure. So it's almost a more comfortable way, a more familiar way to be a fly on the wall for these extreme situations, at least for someone like me. So, say in the Friends of Eddie Coyle, say sitting at a bus station or a train station with a car full of M16 rifles to sell them to someone, and getting done by the police. Like, that's so far outside of my experience that it's fascinating reading about that, particularly when it does have that sense of reality, when it feels authentic. And I guess his position as an attorney lends it that verisimilitude. But that does seem to be a strength of genre fiction.
Well, I think that as far as crime fiction is concerned, and certainly my type of this kind of like hard-boiled noir fiction, is that I'm depicting a lot of violence. It doesn't mean that I think that violence is, cool or whatever, but there's always going to be a fascination with violence, because an act of violence can change your life in a split second. You could die, you could be paralyzed for life, or something else could happen. So these situations are always going to be fascinating and compelling, because that sense of danger is real. It comes from the real world. And I think that there's also, there is an element of horror in these books. Not that I'm trying to write some kind of Stephen King novel or whatever, but real life violence can be horrifying. It's not cool. It's not fun. It's not like the movies. And what I'm going for, again, is just the overall reading experience. I don't necessarily want you to think that, you should act like these people, or that you would want to associate with them, but you are fascinated by what they do and why they do it. That's the important thing. So you are leaving, the real world behind in a sense, and going into this dreamlike noir world. But a lot of the real life horror that's there, kind of this horror that you might get in a nightmare, is, I think, always going to be a big part of what I write. And then, probably some of that comes from Kafka. Some of that comes from Celine, these writers of, bad dreams, essentially.
Yeah.
Knut Hamsun, he's another guy.
Yeah, I guess so. Of course, the thoughts of an author are instantiated in that author's mind, but yeah, it's not necessarily an endorsement. So yeah, I guess J.G. Ballard wasn't endorsing having sex with cars, and, but it's still fascinating to think that thought was in there. He clearly thought about it enough to make Crash.
Yeah, he did. He did some kind of like modern art exhibition before I think the novel came out,
Yeah.
and I think that scandalized a few people.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Was
it was
that the one where
he clearly thought about for quite a while.
Was that the one where he had topless models showing people crashed cars?
Yeah, I haven't looked into it in a while, but I'm pretty sure that was the one. Yeah, because it was at an art gallery, and it was like topless women and car parts and stuff like that. Very, very Ballardian.
What an absolute fruitcake! Yep. So, I was wanting to ask you a bit about Apocalypse Confidential.
Oh, sure.
So, I imagine most people listening will actually be familiar with it, but for those who aren't, what is Apocalypse Confidential?
So Apocalypse Confidential is a literary magazine that deals with the occult. And the occult is the hidden world. It's the world that's there, but that you don't necessarily see at your fingertips or in your everyday life. And that can mean any number of things. For a lot of our readers or contributors, it means the parapolitical world. The stuff that's really going on behind the scenes. For me, coming as a crime writer, to me, the occult is organized crime. For lack of a better word, it's like mafia type behavior. And that does kind of trickle over into the parapolitical world because, the mob is all over, Operation Gladio and, the JFK assassination and all that kind of stuff. So they are involved in these kinds of events. But that's really what it means to me. And, if you go on our website, there's all kinds of, influences or, things that we're looking for. But I think that it does kind of fit into a single package because if you look at what we've actually published, it does fit into a single aesthetic model, despite the fact that these writers are coming from very different backgrounds, sometimes writing in different genres or having very different subjects, but it all makes sense once it's on the website or, if you look at our books, they all kind of make sense because, there's always going to be something of a paranoid element to it, whether you're a gangster or you're some kind of conspiracy theorist or you've noticed something odd, when you get up to go to the bathroom in the morning, that kind of thing. Could be anything. So that's just as a general descriptor, I'd say, yeah, we're a journal of the occult in the hidden world, and that has many different manifestations. And the manifestation, when it finally happens, can be horrifying.
I wasn't aware of the parapolitical angle until I was looking through the website in a bit more detail for this. Are you yourself a fan of détournement and psychogeography and subliminal jihad and all of that, or are those more the other people at AppCon?
Well, I don't know that much about subliminal jihad. I know quite a bit about détournement and psychogeography because, back when I was reading Ballard and, Burroughs, I was reading a lot of situationist stuff as well, like the situationist anthology and, the Derivé and all that stuff. Debord, the name, all those guys. I'm not an anarchist or any kind of, left-wing person now, but not that I was at the time either, but it was interesting to me. And again, it was being, talked about by a lot of these bands that I followed. I was a big Manic Street Preachers fan at the time, like, the Welsh band. And they were working class socialists from the small mining town in Wales, and they'd grown up with the Sex Pistols and bands like that. And, so they were all over this kind of stuff. And that's where I got it from. So that was another kind of, along with Wilhelm Reich, that's also some of the stuff that I was reading more as a teenager. But yeah, some of the other stuff I don't know because I kind of pay attention to it, but that's not my world. I'm pretty much crime fiction, crime movies, crime art all the time. At least on my Twitter page or my public persona.
On the side of the spectacle.
Yeah. Well, I think I always have been. I think I never fooled myself to think I was an anarchist or something. I always I was always a big fan of the spectacle.
The problem with the spectacle is it is pretty enjoyable to take part in by design. But I can't claim to be a deep reader or interpreter of the Situationists. I've only read The Society of the Spectacle, and that's the extent of my interaction with them. But it did make a lot of sense when I was looking through the AppCon website and I saw references to the Situationists that really clicked.
Well, I think part of that too is that the last special we put out was Babel. We'll put out, we put out usually like 4 specials a year where we just, we'll ask for submissions and then we'll pick, the 10 best stories, the 5 best poems, and then, another, maybe 2 or 3 essays and works of art as well. And Babel did explicitly deal with the city and psychogeography and the flaneur, and all those great features of urban life. So I think, that was something that recently, like, we got heavily into, and that was because that was our last special. And the next one is going to be the S word, which is sword and sorcery, fantasy. So that's going to be coming out in the spring. So we've really done a 180 from being deep inside the concrete jungle to, sword and sandals type stuff.
Nice. Apocalypse Confidential fantasy is something that I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah, I am too. Yeah, so thank you. Yeah. So everybody, keep an eye out for that. That's going to be awesome. It's so submissions, go through March, and then it'll be out a little bit after that. So that'll be our own little start to the spring when that finally happens. The S word.
So this question might sound slightly glib, but I am an AppCon enjoyer. But what do you see as the purpose of Apocalypse Confidential as being in a world where there are, say, there's the self-publishing option available to people. There are large publishing houses like the Big Five. What are presses and magazines like Apocalypse Confidential doing? One of the first things I think of is you guys all have great taste.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think that, for me personally, I don't even pay attention to the Big Five anymore. To me, that's dead. That's been dead for a while. Mm-hmm. I have my own views of the publishing industry. And to me, I think some of the rot started to set in around late 70s, early 80s when the trade paperback era started. And that introduced a lot of corner cutting, a lot of like overcharging, kind of like cartel type behavior. And now that's pretty much all it is. There's the Big Five, and they're all indistinguishable from each other, and they all suck. Like, I can't think of anything good that's coming out of that. That's not just me, like, railing against the industry. To me, that's just a fact. If I thought something that was, if I thought there was something of value there, then I would say that, and I would, try to be part of that world. But I don't think there is anymore. Like, that's all done. As far as Apocalypse Confidential is concerned, we've been around for a few years now. And I think that the main thing that what I enjoy the most is giving a voice, a forum for authors who are maybe underpublished because despite being very good writers, they didn't have anywhere to send their stuff before that. And, a few years ago when we started, that was huge. And I was blown away by the stuff that we got from people I never even heard of, and that still happens. I'm a little more used to it now, but that was like an everyday occurrence and I couldn't believe it. And that's really what feels good about being part of Apocalypse Confidential. And I think why people who are good writers feel confident sending us their stuff, because they know that if it is good enough, we will publish it, so long as it fits within, our kind of guidelines or what we want as a magazine. So that's been awesome, just to get great pieces of writing from writers who didn't publish very much before sending their stuff to us.
Yeah, there is an indistinguishability to big publishers. I'm not sure if, say, Zone Books, when I think of Zone Books and what they're publishing, there's something very particular I have in mind. I'm not sure if they're owned by one of the larger ones, but the smaller presses do still have that personality, and it is nice being able to get a book from Amphetamine Sulfate and know, this is going to be an Amphetamine Sulfate book, or something from Apocalypse Confidential and know kind of what that Apocalypse Confidential feels going to be like. It's like some of the smaller record labels where you'll get music from them really based on the judgment of the people selecting bands to sign. So, if you listen to a Profound Law or an Iron Bonehead published band, you kind of have an idea of what you're in for, and you have some degree of confidence that it's going to be good.
Well, that's not a bad analogy because, again, I was a musician before I became a writer, a couple of other the AppCon guys, plenty of my mutuals online. And I think that's part of why we do things the way that we do, and we just do them because we're all used to being indie musicians, there's nothing stopping you from doing anything. If you want to join a band, join a band. You want to put out a record. You want to tour, you go tour. You just have to do it yourself. You just have to be the man and kind of let the chips fall where they may. You have to have that attitude. And, I learned that as a musician, and that's really carried over into publishing, and that's just how I approach it. I don't mind being boutique. I don't mind being indie. I don't mind being any of those things. All I'm really looking for, again, is literary value and aesthetic value. That's it.
Yeah, so are you in the trenches reading submissions yourself?
Oh, for years, yeah. The thing about it is, now I used to be fiction editor, and I'm now managing editor. So I have more authority, but less work to do. So it's kind of an ideal situation, I think, with every promotion. And so I still read everything that comes in. And, Gwen and Dawson are the fiction editors now. We have two, because we get a lot of submissions. And I do read everything that comes in, but there's less pressure because I don't have to respond to them and say, you've been accepted or rejected. I can read everything that comes in, kind of check the temperature. If Dawson or Gwen have a question to ask me, they certainly can. Or if I have a question to ask them, I'm always in communication with them. So I just kind of float around, try to manage things. And also I try to be a good spokesman for the press and to present it in a way that I want us to be seen. So that's a big part of it.
Yeah. There are a few things I want to ask, actually. One, what do you or did you play in music?
Oh, well, I was, as a songwriter, so I played guitar. I've been playing guitar for a while, and I was very much a Les Paul Marshall stack guy. So that's what I was doing. That's maybe you can tell that from the writing that I've still got a Les Paul and a Marshall stack, and I want to make the biggest, noise possible.
What genres?
It was definitely rock music. The real band that I was in, we'd all grown up listening to like Britpop, like stuff like, Blur and, some older bands like the Smiths. So we were into that. And then my guitar sound was, it was probably closer to like Hum or the Deftones, it was in a drop tuning, pretty drone, like bands like Killing Joke as well, so it's pretty drony, pretty loud and heavy, but with, still kind of a conventional kind of like pop song structure. So that's what I was doing, kind of like in my 20s before I started writing fiction.
Do you feel like in writing fiction, that impetus to write songs was displaced? Like, did it find a different outlet and you didn't feel as much need to write music, or did you just feel the need to do both at the same time? Or some secret third thing?
It was a pretty gradual transition. It certainly didn't happen overnight, but I think it was a natural one because I was just used to, keeping little notebooks and writing things down and reading lots of books to get ideas for lyrics. So the only thing that's different now is that my notebooks are all for, either poetry or fiction. And I'm still reading lots of books. So yeah, it is kind of the same thing. I'm used to the creative process and the idea that even if you're not feeling the most inspired, that if you sit down for 2 hours, you'll at least come up with something. You'll have improved your situation by, 10% maybe. Or 5% or even 1%. They're all worth it if they make the end product better in the end. So my methodology, is pretty much the same because I was already used to just coming home from work and sitting down with a guitar and trying to write songs for 2 hours. Instead, I just, write something else. I just write literature. But I sold all my gear. Like I don't.
Oh, really?
Well, I still have my Les Paul because I bought that when I was a teenager after mowing lawns for like 2 years and skipping school lunch and saving all my money and stuff like that. So I will never sell that. But yeah, I sold all my effects pedals, all my amps. I sold all that stuff. I still have my acoustic and I play that a lot for, more like therapeutic reasons. But I still listen to a lot of music and I still play it, but not publicly. And I don't write songs because, that takes a lot out of you. That takes a lot of time. I'm not going to try to write songs and write fiction at the same time. I'm not going to try to serve two masters. So the master now is definitely fiction.
Selling your effects pedals is dangerous because it just seems like it's such an easy place to lose money buying fucking stupid effects pedals that you definitely don't need. But in the moment, you can convince yourself that you really, really need this new reverb pedal.
It's very much the candy store effect. If you walk into a guitar, it's like, and who knows if you're actually going to use it. You might use it for like 5 seconds of one song, that nobody hears on the recording or whatever. But if you're a musician, that's just what you do. So yeah, but yeah, I mean, now that you bring that up, I mean, again, it's an analogous situation. It doesn't feel that different. The only thing that's different is that I'm writing fiction instead of writing songs. That's it.
And do you feel like sort of acting as, I guess in some ways, your job or the job of Apocalypse Confidential is to have good taste in literature, and then and then combine that with other things like your graphic design's really, really cool. So there are other things go into it, but a large component of it is having good taste. And do you feel like that benefits your writing? So spending time, I'm not sure how regularly you do it, each day or every however many days, reading submissions, trying to work out if they're really worth pursuing and putting resources into, and honing your taste. Does that feed back into your writing, or is it hard to judge the quality of your own writing in as detached a way as you might be looking at someone else's?
Well, I think you always need an editor. I mean, especially if you're putting out a long form narrative like a novel, you can't just rely on your own judgment. You need somebody else to look at it. And that's what I'm doing right now with my novel. I sent it out to a bunch of mutuals, and there's a fair number of, first generation Irish characters who are in the book. So I sent it to a bunch of Irish mutuals, and I was like, is this like stage patty whackery? Like, tell me if it's like, if it's just like this garbage. I don't think it is, but I want to make sure that, no stone is unturned, before I finally, kind of unleash it on the world. But yeah, I mean, taste is extremely important. If you're running a press, that's got to be your number one concern, I think, because we're not doing it for the money. I serve literature. I don't serve mammon. I'm not trying to make money off of this. I have a job. But that means that I can just do whatever I want when I write, or as a press, we can publish whatever we want, because we're not trying to like make it big. But the thing is, I don't think there's anywhere to make it big too now. Like who's going to like scoop up Apocalypse Confidential? Like, that's not the way big presses work anymore. So there's really nothing to lose just by going all the way. Because if you're going to be independent, I think you should be really independent and just publish whatever you want. You shouldn't do things by half measures. You just go all the way.
Yeah. Are there times when you're evaluating a submission and you think it meets the benchmark for literary quality, but it's not addressing that parapolitical, that hidden world aspect of Apocalypse Confidential, and you decide not to go ahead with it? Or is it really, if you think something is well written, you're gonna run with it?
I mean, that's another good question. I think that the answer is that no, even if it's well written, we're not going to publish it if it doesn't fit in with kind of our general aesthetic. One thing that, does happen quite a bit is that, we'll have these specials that are kind of geared around one thing, like Babel and psychogeography, or, this S-word special that's coming up, that's sword and sorcery, is that sometimes we will get submissions that are good, but don't necessarily fit into the theme that we're working with. So what we'll do is we'll message the writer back and say, well, we can't really use this for the special, but can we just publish this as a general submission? And we've done that a ton of times, published a lot of great stuff that way. So I think that, yeah, in terms of our actual practice, like, that does come into play. But I think that as an editor, you have to defend the magazine. You can't start publishing stuff that has nothing to do with your mission statement, because then you'll just get flooded with subs that have nothing to do with what your magazine does. And that can just be kind of depressing. So the taste barriers have to go up, not necessarily, mainstream taste, but our taste. It's got to satisfy our requirements before we publish it, even if it's well written.
Yeah. Is it, in reading these submissions, is it something that's shocked you, just the sheer amount of talent floating around by just people you've never heard of, or someone who's just, I don't know, their previous work will be just something they self-published, and they're doing it as a weekend warrior kind of thing around their day job? Because that's certainly something I've been struck by, because I only started reading more contemporary literature fairly recently, and was so struck by how good so much extremely obscure work is that you'll read because it's an internet friend who put something out on Amazon. Has that worn off for you, or are you still consistently struck by how many good writers there are out there?
I am still consistently struck by it. And that's one of the reasons why I love being part of Apocalypse Confidential so much, and why I believe in what we do so much, because we are giving a platform for all these very talented writers who didn't necessarily have a place to send their stuff to before. Like, no one was catering to them or asking for subs. And I think in a sense, I am kind of shocked and surprised that there is so much talent out there, but also I'm not, because I have a pretty good idea of how the mainstream publishing industry works, and they've thrown up their barriers to a lot of stuff, and the end result is that they just end up recycling garbage over and over again. I don't look to the big five or big publishing for anything anymore. It's not to say that everything that gets published on an independent press is good. I mean, certainly not. But the more interesting stuff is coming from indie presses, simply because mainstream publishers are not going to touch it.
Yeah. There are a number of parameters along which things can be interesting and probably won't make it through a major press, or at least make it through unchanged. Like, I don't know, sufficiently funny books are often too shocking to get conventionally published. There's a lot of weirdness. Apocalypse Confidential publishes nice, clean books, but there also is a certain magic to reading something where the formatting's wonky. There might be some spelling errors or typos, but it's still got the special sauce. That's fun. It feels like you're really interacting with something exciting and slightly dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of, kind of like Samizdat publishing, and kind of like unofficial bootleg stuff, as well, or forgotten PDFs and stuff like that. There's lots of different rabbit holes you can go down to as well with some of that stuff, and that influences what we do. That influences what I write, because I grew up going to like secondhand bookstores and just finding kind of like odd books, published by who knows what, and you never knew what you were going to find in a place like that. So yeah, I mean, I love stuff like that. And but as Apocalypse Confidential, I mean, we're all about capital A aesthetic. So we do want everything to look professional. We don't want to put ourselves in a bad light. We don't want to look like, I mean, obviously we are indie, and I think that in terms of what we publish, we are very indie in terms of subject matter and theme. But we don't want it to look shoddy. We don't want it to look like we're like a bunch of chancers, or that we're just amateurs, fumbling around. We want to show that this is serious, like that there are alternatives to the big five. Like, you don't have to do that. You can make something cool, publish it with somebody like us. We're giving you a gateway, a platform to do that. At least that's what we try to do.
Yeah, for listeners who haven't had a look, it is well worth looking at the Apocalypse Confidential website and their Twitter page. I'll put the links to those in the show notes, because the aesthetics are crisp, they're very unified, and very satisfying.
Well, I really have to give Jacob a lot of credit for that. He's the editor-in-chief. And that was the thing that struck me about the press, when I first saw it, because I discovered them pretty much right after Jacob started it in early 2021. And I thought that it had been around much longer than it actually had been, because it just looked so good and so in line with my own tastes. So I was like, well, where have these guys been all my life? And the answer was they'd only been around for probably 2 months, at the time that I found it out. But yeah, I fell in love right away with the magazine. And the first few things that I contributed there were poetry. And then I wrote a couple stories, and then Jacob knew that I was a fan of the press, and then at the end of the first year, he asked me to come on as fiction editor, and that was really a dream come true, because I'd never even thought of it. I loved the magazine, and I really felt honored being published by them, but to be a part of it, I'd never considered that. So that was pretty mind blowing to me, and probably still is. And I feel extremely privileged to be a part of Apocalypse Confidential.
You able to make any educated guesses as to where publishing is going to go over the next few years? Because it seems like, say, print-on-demand services are a huge game changer. The popping up of so many independent publishers seems like a big change. But do you have a feel for how this is going to play out over years or longer?
To be honest, I'm not really sure. But I mean, this is probably... if you look at the different milestones in publishing, you've got Gutenberg. You've got, kind of like the mass publishing of the early 20th century. And then you have what we have now. Those are probably the biggest three events. So I honestly don't know, but I just know that the big five is so bad. I mean, people are just going to lose interest in what they're publishing. And I can't tell you who's going to kind of take over or fill the void, or really what's going to happen. But I think that mainstream publishing is just going to gradually die because those institutions have all been hollowed out. And, what's going to take its place is, what's now probably independent. But as to who's going to rise to the top or what people are going to be concerned with, I don't really know. But I don't need to be concerned with that because 100% of my attention is focused on Apocalypse Confidential. I'm just trying to make sure that we're as good as we possibly can be and that my commitment to the magazine is full and we do a good job on our end. That's really all we can do. So that's really what I try to focus on. So the future of publishing itself, I mean, I have a few guesses, but it doesn't really matter. All that really matters is that what Apocalypse Confidential is good and satisfies our own expectations and, hopefully gives people something entertaining and interesting to read.
It's, I mean, I guess the big five are good in that they have the money to buy the rights to classics and print those. But in terms of generating new culture, I'm not really paying attention to them. It is much more to weird publishers whose presence will be basically a Twitter profile and maybe a website. Apocalypse Confidential is establishment in that you've actually got a website rather than just a Twitter shitpost profile.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great time to start a magazine. I mean, some people on Twitter sometimes complain, oh, there's too many magazines, there's too many podcasts. It's like, well, okay, whatever. So all I try to do is just make sure our magazine is as good as it possibly can be, and that when I come on a podcast like yours, I try to do a good job, getting the message across, or at least giving an idea of what we do as a magazine. I take that very seriously, just because, again, I believe in what we're doing. And, what happens to everybody else, like, I have no idea. So it's not that I don't care. It's just I can't control it. I have my mutuals, I have my friends. There are people that I respect and that I think are doing a good job. But, I mean, who really knows? But it's, it's a time to kind of, get in there and do your thing. If you feel like publishing something or starting a magazine, just go ahead and do it. Just make sure that you're committed to it.
It's a cool time to be writing where you do have quite a large number of people putting a remarkable amount of effort into writing books, into running presses, running magazines, with really little promise of making much money in return, doing it for the love of the game, which is very cool. There is there is some screening function just within the, I guess, almost the lack of mainstream prestige associated with it. Makes sure that really just the weirdos who are really in it for the love of writing.
That's not necessarily a bad thing either, I mean,
I think it's
leave it to the real freaks to do it. But the way I look at it is that, maybe 100 years from now or even further in the future, when people look back at this time, what was going on in literature, what are they going to see? How are they going to judge us? What are they going to think was happening? So I want us to, kind of put our oar in there and at least do what we can to make some kind of impact, make some kind of impression, or at least give a voice to very talented writers like Anna, so that's really the most that we can do.
Yeah. And on that note, are there authors that you particularly recommend at the moment that you've been really enjoying? Any shout outs that you want to give?
Any shout outs? I mean, I'd rather not because I'm going to forget somebody.
It's dangerous, isn't it?
But most of the writers that I like, I mean, have been published in Apocalypse Confidential at some time. But I mean, there's lots of stuff out there. So yeah, I mean, I would just say, just get on Twitter, start getting familiar with some of these presses, and if you've got something, submit it. Get in the game. I'm all for that.
Yeah, and before we wrap up, is there anything else of yours that you want to shill? We're very, very pro shilling here.
Well, if you haven't...
Anything that you want people to be aware of?
Well, if you haven't read God is a Killer, you should buy a copy because even if you don't feel like reading it, it looks great on your coffee table. It really ties the whole room together.
Yeah.
It's got a beautiful cover by Matthew Revert, fellow Australian, who has done tons of indie book covers. It's absolutely one of the best in the game. I was very glad he agreed to do it for me. I'm unbelievably happy with his work there. So check that out, and check out Apocalypse Confidential. Our website is apocalypse-confidential.com. And if you've got any sword and sorcery stories, send them our way before March 16th.
Nice. Well, thanks so much for coming on. I really, really look forward to your next novel, to your script as well, if and when that makes it onto the screen.
Yeah, hopefully we'll see. but yeah, I'm optimistic going forward. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on here, Jack. It's been a pure pleasure.
No worries. Thanks for writing God is a Killer. Thanks for your work with Apocalypse Confidential. It's a super, super exciting series of projects.
All right, well, thank you again.
No worries. And for listeners, see you next time.